Hey guys, so I've been requested to go over my notes for Ruth, and it's only 4 chapters, but I feel like the amount of notes I have will make it pretty long, so I might split it into 2 parts. But, for the first chapter, I just commented that when they were discussing in the country of Moab, so that's where they went, in Moab, they worshipped pagan gods, which was probably not the best idea for someone who worships God to go into another country where they worship different gods. And then I just kind of did a character study on Naomi and Orpah. So Naomi, I noticed that she was the wife of Elimelech. She was the mother of Nahon and Chilion. I hope that's right. She's also the mother-in-law to Ruth and Orpah, obviously, and her husband died along with her sons while they were in Moab. And she was nice enough to let Orpah go, and Ruth go back home if they wanted to, and then she returned back to Judah. And then Orpah was the daughter-in-law of Naomi and Elimelech. She was a sister-in-law to Ruth. She was a wife. When Naomi gave them the option to return home, Orpah accepted it. And then down here, it talks about how, Orpah left, but Ruth clung to her. So I said we should love people with the same love and respect that Ruth had for Naomi. I'm going to do that a lot, I bet. I'll probably mix up all their names. I didn't do anything over Ruth yet because I have, like, a big thing of Ruth and I needed more space, so I waited until the end. But I did do a little study on her, too. In verse 18, where it says, "And Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, and she said no more," I wrote out that we should love people with a love that is so deep, and one that they can't deny. And then in verse 19, where it says, "So the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem, and when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, 'Is this Naomi?'" And this was in my study Bible, but it says Bethlehem was a smaller city, and like today, it was kind of one of those everyone knows everyone towns. But it also seems possible that Naomi's husband was a prominent figure in the society, or in the city, sorry. And then jumping down to verse 2 of chapter 2, it talked about how Naomi went and she gleaned the field. And gleaning was allowed by God to the poor and the strangers, and he even commanded the Israelites not to go back and collect what was overlooked while harvesting, and this is explained in Leviticus 19, 9 through 10, and then I commented that this was one of the many ways that God made sure everyone was taken care of, because he made sure specifically to tell the Israelites that they could not go back and collect anything that they missed, because that could be left for people who were hungry. And then verse 9 talks about how it's the verse where Boaz tells Ruth not to go to any other fields and to stay in his field, because he told all of the people not to mess with her, not to touch her, not to do anything. So Boaz was being protective over Ruth, and he ensured her safety. Honestly, this is going faster than I thought it would. So verse 17, it was talking about an ephah. I really cannot pronounce that word, so I am sorry, of barley, and that was basically about 1 bushel, which would have been enough for a couple of days for food. And then in verse 20, it talks about the man is a close relative of ours. He's our redeemer. And I just explained what a kinsman redeemer was in the side. So I said in Leviticus, I almost said Levi, in Leviticus 25:25, it describes how a closest relative can buy back the property that has been sold. And since Ruth I cannot say it. It's Ruth was a widow, but I want to start saying Ruth was a widow. Ruth was a widow. She could only marry the closest relative, and there was a closer relative than Boaz. So Boaz had to make sure that this relative didn't want to be the kinsman redeemer for Ruth before he could do it. And then in verse 11, it talks about how all the fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. But in, I think it was like the King James Version, I talked to her about her being a virtuous woman, so I just wrote out, like, am I known as a virtuous woman? Just as a little question. And then in in chapter 4, the first verse, it says, "Now Boaz had gone up to the gate." And the town gate, this is also from my study Bible, the town gate was the center of activity in the ancient cities, and villages often gathered there. to talk about things that were going on in the city, to do business stuff and legal proceedings. So all of those kinds of activities happened at the gate of the city. And then for verses, the last bit of 4, 5, 6, and then 10, I wrote at Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10 describes how if the relatives were to marry Ruth, her firstborn son would have been given the name of her husband that was now deceased. So he would also have to marry a Moabite woman, and so that one is why he didn't really want to marry the one who was closer than Boaz was. Why he didn't really want to marry, almost said Naomi, Ruth. But he would also have to marry her, and she was a Moabite woman, and that would mean that they would have kids that shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. So it was not an ideal situation to put yourself in, but Boaz did it because he loved and adored Ruth. And then we'll get to this one, which is me breaking down all of the information we were given about Ruth in here. She was the daughter-in-law of Naomi and Elimelech, later to Salmon after marrying Boaz. So she was a widow. She was a sister-in-law to Orpah. When Naomi gave them the option to return home, she did not accept it, and she stayed with Naomi. She is loyal and loving. We get that from her action there. She also gleaned the fields so that her and Naomi would have food, so she's hardworking. Boaz saw her in his field and made sure that she was protected. She was very humble, which you can see in chapter 2, verse 10. She followed Naomi's plan for Boaz to marry her because Naomi kind of came up with a little plan. She was known as a virtuous woman, which we talked about earlier. She was the mother of Obed, and she's mentioned in the lineage of Jesus. And so here, you might just want to take like a screenshot of it because it's so long that I'm probably not going to read out all of the names. But this is from Matthew 11. I just wrote out all the names that are mentioned there, and then it ends with Mary, who gave birth to Jesus, who was called the Messiah. So you could see Perez right here. You could see Ram. You can see Aminadab, Nason. Where's he at? There we go. And then Obed, obviously, is right here. And then Jesse, and then David. So I just kind of highlighted the ones that are mentioned in the ancestors, basically, of Ruth, and how she falls right into the genealogy of Jesus. So because she's Obed of Ruth. So she's one of the women mentioned. But anyway, that's all of my notes. I'm going to, kind of let you have time to screenshot things. So I'm just going to leave them there for a couple of seconds, and then if you want to read it for yourself, because sometimes I stutter and I cannot read my own handwriting. But anyway, that is all I have for Ruth, at least right now. So I hope that was helpful.